The morning air along Riverside Avenue had the brittle chill of late autumn, the kind that made the breath come out in small white clouds, and the river look like a ribbon of pewter. Lee Z kept to the same loop she had for years, sneakers barely whispering against wet concrete, ponytail swaying like the trailing end of a rehearsal costume. She ran not to outrun anything, but to arrive at herself, at the studio before the city woke fully, at the bar before her muscles remembered the day's performance. Dawn tasted of metal and coffee, of the glue-sweet smell of stage rosin left in a dancer's hair. It steadied her. Halfway around the bend, a man in a long charcoal coat stood beside the pavement, a thermos clutched at his hip as if it were an accessory. He was tall enough to be a landmark. There was a face the public knew, the CEO whose company had bought half the primetime ad slots and sponsored the network's talent shows, a man who appeared in magazine covers with angular suits and the same unreadable smile. He wore sunglasses at dawn, like a man mocking the notion of privacy. Lee Z's steps slowed unconsciously. She knew him. Who in the city didn't? But she had never been one to stop for famous faces. The thermos cap hissed open, and a cloud of cold vapor breathed out. Winter in a cup. Heat and thirst met there, simple and human. Her throat had gone desert dry from the run. Without thinking about headlines or cameras or the inch-thick glass wall that separated private men from public people, she crossed the curb. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was small in the hush. "Do you mind?" The man glanced up. For a fraction of a second, the sunglasses came off, and the city paused on the unexpected. Eyes the color of old tea, cool as river stone. He lifted the bottle like a gentleman, offering a hand. "Take it," he said. The voice was the same in the recordings that would later spin the narrative. Low, careful, a professionalism of sound. Lee Z wrapped both hands around the thermos cap, the metal biting into her palms through her gloves, and drank. The water slipped down like silk, cold and bright, and the world narrowed to the single honest relief in her mouth. When she raised her head, the man had turned his face away. A phone camera had already nicked the moment. A blink, a sliver of a smile, the cap in Lee Z's fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck wheezed. A gull cried twice. Nothing felt monumental. She smiled a reflexive, embarrassed smile and jogged on. The photo went viral within an hour. It didn't matter at first. Countless images vanished into the city's hungry feed and were forgotten. What transformed it into a public inferno was a caption, sharp, insinuating, and written as if it were a fact. "Jogger drinks CEO's water. Who is she?" The insinuation hit like a gust that scattered everything unattended. The comment chains blanketed the image in theories. A flirtation, a secret rendezvous, a plant. The thermos, stamped with the CEO's minimalist crest, became evidence of intimacy. By noon, the image was a trend topic, and by evening, it had a nickname: Watergate. Lee Z found the first comments when she checked her phone during a short break at the studio. The room smelled of sweat and the rubbery tang of practice sneakers. Her phone lit up as if it had been waiting only for bad news. She read the screenshots, the meme accounts, the speculative captions. Her stomach turned. Ji? Song Ying, the troupe's social coordinator, plucked the phone from her hand with gentle efficiency and frowned as if the instrument had betrayed them both. Don't look. It's nothing. It will blow over. Blow over? Li Ji's laugh was a raw instrument. How? They put my face next to his thermos, like I'm asking for something. Song Ying's expression tightened. There will be statements. We'll ask the studio for release forms. This, she waved a hand the way people try to dismiss storms. It's a publicity nibble, but we'll manage. They could not have managed in time. The CEO's name carried a gravitational pull. His PR team, polished and merciless, issued a bland, corporate non-denial. We value staff privacy and ask the public to respect it. Then there were paid columns. Then a late-night talker asked on air whether fidelity now came in thermos form. The story slotted neatly into the city's appetite for celebrity gossip, safer than politics, more combustible than weather reports. Li Ji tried to keep sliding between classes and choreography as if the world had rearranged itself around that personal act of thirst. But the feed was a shifting, hungry beast. A clip from a troll account slowed down the moment her lips touched the metal and looped it, adding sarcastic music and captions that turned a private pause into a public punchline. Someone made an edited video of the CEO's face layered over a swan. Swan's symbolism that should have been flattering became a jibe. Swan and the thermos, grace and ownership. At rehearsal, the director, Kin, sat on the piano bench with shoulders like a dark cloud. Li Ji, you know how image-sensitive this season is, he said, not looking up from his tablet. We have a live tie-in with Prime Show tonight. I know you didn't. His voice trailed off as if the rest was obvious and therefore redundant. Of course I know, she replied. Her hands were trimmed and calloused. After a run, they shook slightly. I won't cause problems. Good, because they're testing the audience's sympathies tonight. The producers love a redemption arc. If you want to keep the lead in Act 2, you have to box this. Quiet. No interviews, no posts. What about the truth? She asked. The question felt private, like a note passed under an exam desk. The truth, Kin said, finally meeting her eyes with something approximating regret, is a luxury. Timing is everything. The phrase landed with a weight she had begun to expect from the industry. Things were not about rightness, but momentum. Li Ji had always been sharp at measuring the distance between those two. Across town, in a glass-walled office that genuflected to the river's light, Zhang Zhiyou watched a montage of the morning's trending topics with the calm of someone who had been taught to read narratives like weather charts. She had rehearsed anger. She had rehearsed disdain. The Zhang family leaned into spectacle when it served them. Engagement parties, charity galas, precisely placed hemlines, the occasional scandal strategically deployed to eclipse a rival. Her hand closed on the stem of a wineglass until the veins in her wrist rose like road maps. Is that her? Aunt Cow's voice carried the authority of a judge and the long memory of a matriarch. She sat framed in an ancestral chair, her jewelry catching the exact cruel light of their dining hall. The tiara, antique, discreetly ostentatious, rested on a velvet cushion behind glass in the hallways. It was the kind of heirloom that accepted itself from conversation. It existed to be owed and displayed. Zhang Zhiyou did not need the name. She had seen Li Ji at company charity rehearsals before, always helpful, always oddly serene for someone who carried the sort of ambiguity that made the household itch. When the family had taken her in as a foster child, she had been grateful. Years of shared life had bound her to the house in ways that felt like threads pulled taut, personal history braided into social currency. And still, there was a private ledger for grievances. "Yes," she said smoothly, "it's her." "She drinks the CEO's water," Aunt Cow said. It was not a question. It was an indictment. "Is she courting him? Is she—" "Stop." Zhang Zhiyo set her glass down, the clink precise. "We are not jealous scolds. We are the Zhang family. This is noise. But if it threatens the engagement—" Her jaw tightened at the last word. The engagement, her engagement, to the man the family had chosen and polished for her, was a network of consequences. A public cloud could scatter that network into ruin. He had been presented to the public as Zhang Zhiyo's fiancé with all the pomp of preordained destinies, matching suits, photo shoots staged against marble staircases, charity announcements strategically timed to cycle out bad press. The family had not only invested money, but reputation. The event was a contract of honor writ large. Within 2 days, the world had made a story of a thermos. A morning show ran a segment titled "Privilege or Privilege Watching" and invited a panel to rehearse outrage. Comments poured in like rain. A former contestant on Prime Show, who had been ousted last season, called Li Ji a climber in an interview that felt rehearsed for maximum cruelty. Li Ji's own social channels, modest, stitched together with rehearsal footage and clumsy promotional posts, filled with messages that mixed pity with accusation. Her followers dropped as if stepping back from a falling chandelier. At night, in the narrow flat she shared with a roommate who worked late as a graphic artist, Li Ji sat on the thin mattress and let the city buzz through the walls. Her phone lay face down beside her like a ticking thing she could not dismantle. She had never wanted to be more public than the stage demanded. Her performances had always been enough. A space where control colluded with surrender, where she could say more with an arch of a wrist than words ever allowed. To be thrust into scandal for a moment of human need felt obscene. She tried to map the consequences, choreographies canceled, solo parts reassigned, sponsors who valued neutrality asking for disclaimers. The line between opportunity and ruin blurred. Her hands found an old sketchbook. She drew a swan with a wing that might have been a hand or a feather, and beneath it she wrote nothing at all. The swan motif had always lingered in her mind. Memory of a children's recital, of a teacher's admonition to move like the bird even when your limbs betrayed you. Now the image felt like both a costume and a cage. On the first night, the producers called her into a conference room that smelled of recycled air and nervous cologne. Cameras were a rumor in the hallways now, and people spoke as if the city hid microphones in the wallpaper. A stern woman from PR sat across the table, her hair a strategic helmet. "We have a plan," she said. "We want to control the narrative. You will appear on Prime Show tonight to tell your side. We'll rehearse your lines. Keep it measured." Li Ji felt a rustling of the old instinct, the artist's need to perform, to turn pain into a shape that the public could understand. But there was another voice inside her that said no. The memory of the CEO's hands holding a thermos, the simple civility of an offered cup, those small human things mattered more than strategic statements. To perform contrition would be to admit a culpability she did not feel. "I don't want to manipulate my truth," she said. The words came out softer than she'd intended. "I don't want to be a spectacle." The PR woman pressed a pen into a notebook. "Child, the public doesn't need truth. They need a story they can accept. We'll help you tell it." If truth was a luxury, as Qin had said, then Li Ji was not prepared to buy it with her dignity. Meanwhile, the CEO, Fu Yanzhe, found his own private life a battlefield. He had not expected the thermos to become an icon. He had been walking before meetings because he liked the river's quiet and the idea of being able to think in 2-mile increments. He was meticulous about image in private because it simplified choice. When the image of the jogger took on a life of its own, his office's legal counsel drafted a carefully neutral statement. His PR arranged a downbeat charity announcement to drive the feed into safer territory, and his inbox filled with polite threats masked as offers. He had always been effective at steering storms away by redirecting attention, donations, a new initiative to support independent artists, a quietly placed op-ed on corporate responsibility. Only he did not anticipate the symmetries of human sympathy. In an interview clip that cut across morning shows, a media pundit mused that perhaps the jogger had been trying to climb into the social ladder. The word was electric. It implied agency where there might only have been human need. It implied intention that had not existed. Fu Yanzhe watched the clip with the cool dispassion of someone who calculated optics as method. There was discomfort, but it was a kind he could file under inconvenient. His mind moved immediately to damage control. He did not think of Li Ji as a person in those early minutes. She was an element in the field of potential collateral, a variable to be corrected. That mental distance was not cruelty as much as habit. He had trained himself to be unshakable. He had, however, not anticipated Lu Yanjing. Lu Yanjing learned quickly that public defense required a kind of theatrical courage. He had grown up knowing the city's rhythms, the sound of a Cassia street vendor, the muffled reverence of families at tea ceremonies, the silent calculations of men and women who used wealth as a way to measure time. He had also grown up with Li Ji, the child who skated on borrowed patience, who rehearsed pirouettes until dawn, who kept secrets under the bed in folded pages. Where others saw a viral screenshot, Lu Yanjing saw a person and a wrong. He did what those who have seen injustice do. He intervened publicly. He posted a short video on his own channel, a 5-minute clip of him and Li Ji at the rehearsal studio, footage of their childhood photos, lines about loyalty and what it meant to know someone. His words were spare but direct. Li Ji is not what the internet wants her to be. She is my friend. Let us give her the grace of truth. It should have been a small thing. In a week of calculated outrage, this was an act of unplanned kindness. The video's comments overflowed with support faster than the trolls could mobilize. In forums and niche blogs, his defense became a nucleus around which others gathered. The narrative split. Sympathy for Li Ji grew. It did not erase the heat, but added a countercurrent, and in a way that unsettled the PR teams who had expected a single direction of pressure. Zhang Zhiyou watched Lu Yanjing's video with a slow, assessing look. Her engagement gala had been scheduled to coincide in the family's neat calendar with a week of favorable press. Lao Yanjing's intervention risked redirecting attention toward inconvenient questions. Why was Li Ji still in the Zhang household's orbit? Had the family wronged her in ways that had been repressed? Zhang Zhiyu felt the thrum of danger. She called a meeting with Aunt Kya and the household council. "We must be measured," she said. And for the first time, there was an echo of uncertainty in her voice. Yanjing is a friend to our house and an asset. We must not alienate him. Aunt Kya's reply was a fusillade, old logic. Duty comprised behavior and appearances. Appearances reinforced duty. Bring the Gentile matters under control, she advised. We are not a circus. But the circus had its own momentum. The reality show tie-in that Kin had feared for Li Ji became a second arena. Prime Show announced an impromptu live stream titled Up Close, The Jogger, the CEO, and the City. The producers loved controversy because controversy brought viewers in the same way a magnet collected filings. They scheduled a live debate segment with hosts primed to incite. Lu Yanjing was invited as an ally, Fu Yanzhe as an oblique figure of interest, and Li Ji, reluctantly boxed by the troupe and her own precarious career, was set to appear for a short segment framed as clarification. Li Ji agreed because she had no convincing alternative. If silence meant the industry would cannibalize her, then a measured voice was a defensive tactic. She sat in the green room with the stage lights bleeding through the curtains, the sound of crew murmurs and the low-frequency hum of cameras like distant thunder. Her stomach felt like a drum. Chin stuck against the doorway, his expression bruised. No poetic speeches, no tearful confessions, just what happened. When she walked on stage, the cameras found her like a flock honing on a glint of silver. The audience was live and loud. The host, all smiles and sharpened bon boss, introduced the segment with the sort of relish that made the words hollow. Tonight, we settle the debate. Coincidence or conspiracy? He asked, his tone a sugarcoating for barbed insinuation. Li Ji's voice was small at first, then steadied. I was jogging, she said plainly. I was thirsty. He offered the thermos. I drank. That is all. But did you know the man? The host pressed. Do you have a relationship with him? Some say, no. She looked out into the rows of lamps and at the camera's inattentive lens. I do not know him beyond that morning. The host simulated surprise and then pivoted to the CEO. The camera cut to Fu Yanzhe in the guest chair, composed in a way that said he had rehearsed cool. He gave a statement that had been rehearsed by his legal team, a neutral echo about privacy and discretion. He did not accuse, he did not defend beyond a corporate blandness. The public read that as a tacit admission or an aloofness, depending on their bias. The chat exploded in parallel. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Go on their bias. The chat exploded in parallel. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Some defended the innocent dignity of a jog. Others sharpened knives. The producers, pleased with metrics, switched to the next segment about brand endorsements. The show moved on, but the day's narrative had changed shape. Sympathy for Li Zi grew in pockets, suspicion hardened elsewhere. The scene ended with applause that sounded both real and performative, like clapping for a practiced routine. After the broadcast, Li Zi returned to the studio with adrenaline making her hands tremble. Her phone buzzed with messages, supportive, angry, trolling. Her inbox contained a terse email from the network. We require a signed consent for tonight's footage. Also, the rest of the line threatened vague consequences that read like a promise. Late that night, as she was about to sleep, someone she had trusted texted a photo, a private one, obtained from a live camera that had, somehow, captured a close-up of the thermos where the CEO's initials were clear. It came with the words, "You should be careful, ZZ. They will turn everything into you." She should have filed the message with the rest of the day's small cruelties. Instead, she felt the heat of shame rise, as if a lamp had been turned on in an empty room. She did not know the architecture of the social engine that had flung her into public view. She had learned, in the most painful way, the difference between an artist's control and the media's appetite. Switching perspective, Zhang Jiyu paced her family's private study, the city below like a pattern in glass. She had always believed in measured reactions, public statements that felt inevitable, and private consequences that unfolded like the tightening of a lock. But the nature of the scandal made calculations messy. What mattered ultimately was the engagement and the household's reputation. Yet her animosity toward Li Zi was not purely strategic. Years of perceived slights, of being elbowed aside by a girl who knew too well how to charm elders with competence, had made her resentful. Li Zi's presence in family photos, offering a small, unstudied smile at anniversaries, had been a thorn. The thermos incident was not merely a rumor. It was fuel for a narrative that could either punish Li Zi for her perceived presumption or force the family into an embarrassing defense. "Do we expel her?" Aunt Kiao suggested, with the long cruelty of a matriarch who had never learned mercy as a policy tool. Zhang Jiyu's fingers drummed a soft rhythm on the table. No, she did not like the hesitancy in her own voice, but we must be decisive. The family council proposed something that would have a public veneer of reason, require Li Zi to make a public apology, and agree to a temporary leave from all family-affiliated events. It would be a spectacle of penitence. It would also appeal the trolls, who needed penitence more than explanation. But a different pressure arrived in the form of an old worry resurfacing: the Kai family. The Qi family were quiet, low profile in public, but possessing of discreet wealth and influence. Their lawyer called one morning to request an urgent meeting. Li Ji's past, it seemed, was not as settled as the Zhang household had assumed. The Qi family claimed a blood tie, a truth confirmed by old midwifery notes and a faded hospital bracelet. The revelation was a soft jab that unsettled the things that mattered most to the Zhang household: lineage, inheritance, and the neat architecture of family history. The possibility that Li Ji was not who the Zhang family had always claimed to be, raised as theirs out of compassion, perhaps, but not theirs by blood, shifted the stakes from a trivial scandal to a potential existential risk for social standing. The legal rhythms that followed were dry but relentless: subpoenas, requests for DNA tests, private investigators tracing Li Ji's earliest records. For Li Ji, who had grown up with no stable paper trail, these legal maneuvers felt like the tiniest needle pricks that eventually hollowed out a person. She was asked to submit to tests as if her body were evidence against a charge. The Qi family's claim complicated things in ways that made Aunt Kiao furious. If Li Ji had legal claims, then parts of the family's carefully designed future might need to be reallocated. Meanwhile, Fu Yanzhe watched the story's trajectory and began to see the pieces shift into a dangerous configuration. His neutral statement had satisfied lawyers but not public curiosity. His PR team recommended a short piece in which he would talk about corporate social responsibility and donate to a program for sports in community centers, an attempt to recenter the narrative. His legal team advised silence on the question of whether he recognized Li Ji. And yet, a slower phenomenon began. Viewers watching the jogger's honest face began to imagine a backstory that did not fit the neat columns of accusation. People wanted the truth, and the truth required someone to assert it. The pivot arrived in the most unlikely way, a dance challenge on social media. Someone had clipped together a sequence of Li Ji's rehearsal moves, underscoring them with a piano version of Swan Lake, and captioning it with the phrase, "Watch what grace looks like when no one is watching." The clip went small viral among dance communities and got shared by those who admired craft. Suddenly, Li Ji was not merely a jogger who had drunk a thermos. She was a dancer whose life could be seen in motion. The city's appetite split further. In the slow arc of public opinion, an artist's authenticity sometimes functioned as a quiet sort of evidence. Lu Yanjing, watching all this from his family-owned boutique that doubled as a studio, felt a fierce protective instinct. He found himself taking more risks on Li Ji's behalf. He offered to bring her into a high-profile charity performance as his partner, to let her artistry speak louder than any headline. "Let the work do the talking," he told her earnestly. "Let them see you as you are." She hesitated. The offer meant visibility, which was double-edged, but it also gave her room to act rather than be acted upon. "I don't want to be someone's shield," she said. "I want to be on my own terms." "You can be both," Lu Yanjing insisted, "and you can have me in the front row." His defense of her was not merely performative. In a city where families traded favors like currency, his public support recalibrated alliances. It introduced a counterforce against those who would reduce her to a controversial headline. It also infuriated Zhang Ziyo, who read Lu Yanjing's intervention as a public siding, a small betrayal that had long-term reverberations for the family's plans. The real fracture came when the producers, ever attuned to the smell of ratings, proposed a live cross-show event, a reality competition segment that would pair two public figures with performers to compete in a charity showcase. The segment would be called Hearts on the Line. It was an invitation to spectacle, judges, live voting, and a segment where the public could decide how reputations should be recalibrated. The producers asked Li Ji to participate as a way to give her a platform for redemption or exposure, depending on the angle. She accepted because refusing felt like an admission of guilt that she had not earned. Lu Yanjing signed on as her partner. Fu Yanza was tapped to be a guest judge for one night. Zhang Ziyo, furious at the potential rearrangement of narratives, demanded that the family's PR release a statement cautioning against using the show's format to rewrite reality. Aunt Chow suggested quietly withdrawing support for the show through advertisement purchases. The city watched the small maneuvers like a spectator sport. Who would blink first? On the night of the event, the studio was a glittering mouth. Lights pounded, and the audience was a sea of phones. The stage was a white expanse staged with a single prop, a large swan statue that glinted like an accusation. Swan had become a motif that every columnist reached for with greedy fingers. They used it both as compliment and as cudgel. The performance itself was an act of reclaiming. Li Ji moved the way she always had when the world narrowed to music, the parts of her body that spoke in a language of balance and breath. Lu Yanjing moved beside her with a tenderness that was not public theater but private fidelity. The judges were moved. The audience voted in raptures. Fu Yanzi sat on the edge of his chair, a rare unclenched attention leaving his features soft. Then, midway through their routine, someone in the front row stood and shouted an accusation about staged scenery and paid votes. The host, who had been preening like a peacock, turned a color that resembled vulnerability for the first time that evening. Cameras panned to the shout. In a way that felt inevitable, the live show became a microcosm of the city. Applause, anger, and the desire to be on one side or another. Li Ji finished her movement with a perfect arabesque. The audience gave her the kind of applause that felt like a temporary truce. Backstage, the feed was already a cacophony of praise and doubt. A faction cheered that art had transcended scandal. Another demanded further verification of everything. And then a new note. A journalist from an investigative outlet posted a piece suggesting that Li Ji's past contained a mystery more complicated than anyone had suspected. A rumor surfaced that she had been involved in a long-ago incident of disappearance, an old missing child case that matched a time and place in her faint memories. The Qi family's lawyer, sensing that the narrative could dismantle more than it repaired, pushed for DNA confirmation. What had begun as a thermos and a jog had mutated into questions about lineage, theft, and the very ownership of personhood. The legal filament pulled taut. Subpoenas arrived with the coldness of a practiced hand. Li Ji's world narrowed again, this time to hospital lights and sterile forms. She consented to a DNA test because it felt like validation of who she was. The technician's gloves smelled of latex and sanitizer. The process, clinical and small, felt momentous. A vial of her blood sat alongside another labeled for comparison. The Qi family furnished their sample. The chain of custody, the notarized forms, the legal shuttles, all the bureaucratic rituals that made truth feel like a document, suddenly held the power that narratives otherwise only approximated. When the results came, they did not fall cleanly into a relief of resolution. The DNA indicated a match, but not in the way the public expected. The Qi family did indeed have a biological link to Li Ji, but the data suggested a lineage tangled with someone many in the Jiang household had preferred not to name. An old family connection that implied not theft, but a mislaid responsibility. The revelation was like a slow drumbeat that made the household's meat architecture wobble. Zhang Zhiyou reacted with a choreography of anger and fear. If Li Ji legally belonged to another family, what claims could be made? What links to inheritance or public duty could be retold? In a world where family names carried weight far beyond affection, the consequences were both personal and structural. Aunt Kaya's fury hardened like ice. The courthouse called for a press conference to be scheduled, where lawyers and emissaries from both families would announce steps towards resolution. Cameras kit-lined the hallway outside the courthouse like a second skin. Li Ji, who had spent weeks navigating the dizzying world of public opinion, found herself suspended between disbelief and a brittle hope. A part of her saw in the DNA confirmation a strange kind of liberation, the chance to untangle what she had been forced to wear like ill-fitting wardrobe. But there was also the humiliation of having one's body read as evidence in a theater of public curiosity. She had no illusions about the world's appetite. The DNA results would be parsed and diced, and whichever narrative had better optics would win. The night before the press conference, Fu Yanzhe called her. He did not speak in the practiced platitudes of his PR team. He spoke softly, like someone who had watched the city rise and wanted it to be less cruel. "Are you okay?" he asked. The question was absurdly human. "No," she admitted, "but I'm here." "Do you want me there?" His voice contained a small suggestion, support without spectacle. "No." She breathed in and out, "not for that reason." He paused, and in the silence there was a mutual understanding. Presence could mean many things. For him, presence had always been an instrument of image. For her, it had the potential to mean witness. "Then I won't. But if you need—" "I know," she said. On the day of the press conference, the courthouse steps were a stage. Cameras flashed like an unending rash. Microphones extended like the tongues of curious beasts. Zhang Ziyo arrived in a suit that signaled control and ritual. Aunt Cha sat like a marble statue. The Qi family's representatives wore quiet suits and carried documents with a calm that suggested resources and resolve. Li Jiao arrived flanked by Lu Yanzheng, who had become her steady shadow, publicly available but never showy. The lawyers made statements that suggested an imminence of legal decisions. The camera caught Li Ji's hands twisting around a water bottle, the image touching old nerves. People asked questions. Li Ji answered with the composure she had finally summoned. "The DNA confirms a biological link to the Qi family," she said. "I had no knowledge, no intention of usurping any position. I accept the legal process." The public parsed the line for sincerity. Public opinion shifted in tiny increments that night, some ways sympathetic, some ways suspicious. Zhang Ziyo watched the way the cameras cut to her with a new calculation. Was the family obligated to apologize for any wrongs? Aunt Cha suggested tough countermeasures. Other voices recommended a reconciliation that would be framed as magnanimous. The family could rewrite the story into one of compassionate guardianship, a narrative the public loved. Or it could double down on its earlier indignation. But in the wings of this public theater, another narrative hummed, the cost of spectacle. Lu Yanjing and a small cadre of friends had begun to organize a campaign that focused on the artist rather than the scandal, an online archive of Li Ji's performances, footage of her practicing into the dawn. It asked that the public consider craft as a lens through which to see a person, not as a stage to punish. A Iniciativa gathered momentum, and the city's reporters began to tilt, in small ways, toward a more complex conversation. What it meant to reduce a person to a headline, and how courage sometimes meant refusing to be defined by a viral moment. Yet, for all these currents, the title of the story, "What Happened When a Jogging Girl Drank the Cold CEO's Water," would not be contained. It lodged in conversation, in dinner party gossip, in the punchlines of late-night shows. It became shorthand for an entire ecosystem's eagerness to create scandal from simple humanity. And it changed the people involved in ways both minor and seismic. Friendships rearranged, engagements reevaluated, careers recalibrated. On a quieter note, Li Zi sat alone on the steps of a small bridge after the press conference. The river moved below like a long-held note. She unscrewed the cap of her thermos and drank, the water warm now, not from heat, but from time. Lu Yangqing came to stand beside her and leaned an elbow on the rail. "You've been brave," he said. "No," she replied, "I've been stubborn." She smiled without irony. "They'll tell this story for months. People will choose sides. For myself, I want to keep dancing." He nodded, the city lights painting his profile like stage makeup. "Then dance," he said simply. "Let them watch." She tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear and watched the river. Somewhere a neon sign hummed, a late bus wheezed. The swan motif felt less like a trap and more like a promise that even in the glare, something of her artistry could remain intact. But the story was not over. The court of public opinion punished and forgave with uneven hands. DNA tests would be checked, contracts might be renegotiated, and the Zhang family's decisions would echo. In the days to come, alliances would be forged and broken. A live show might reveal truths neither camera nor lawyer could fully predict. When she walked away from the bridge, the thermos had been emptied of this night's thirst, but filled with the residue of a long day. She carried it like a talisman that had once been the spark for a firestorm, and yet it did not define all of her. She had, in that simple act, been human. The city would remember otherwise. Outside, the river continued its patient path. Inside, the city was already arranging new stories, new angles, new faces for the morrow's hungry news cycle. Li Zi thought of the stage, of rehearsals at dawn, of the light on her skin when she had once danced as if the world had no watchers. She thought of the swan, and imagined not the caged bird the internet had made of her, but one in motion, self-contained, and fierce. Her phone buzzed one more time, a private message from an unfamiliar number. "We can help, quietly, if you want." She would, in time, accept help, not as submission, but as choosing allies. But for now, the choice was urgent and tiny. To keep practicing pliés while the world argues whether her thirst was scandalous. She tied her shoes and walked back toward the studio where the bar waited, where music would once more give her a language that needed no translation. Across town, decisions were being whispered behind closed doors, alliances were being checked for durability, and the city's appetite continued to feed on the unexpected. The thermos photo had cracked the city's complacency, and out of the crack, the smaller, truer stories began to leak. The hurt of a foster child, the stubborn loyalty of a friend, the quiet courage of a dancer refusing to be reduced. Those stories would not be as loud as headlines, but they were the ones that shaped lives. As the day closed, the image of the jogger and the thermos glowed on 1,000 screens. Somewhere, a columnist wrote a piece titled, "What We Miss When We Look." Another printed a list of 10 ways to be kinder online. A late-night host made a joke and then, unusually, stayed silent for a beat that felt like remorse. And in the center of the city's nervous, luminous web, Li Ji folded herself into the familiar ritual that had always soothed her. The first bar, the callus of foot against floor, the breath measured against music. The cameras might come, producers might strategize, lawyers might shuffle papers, but she had her work, the small, immovable thing that gave her agency when everything else was at risk of being decided for her. The thermos sat on her windowsill, an ordinary object catching morning light. It had been the beginning of a story neither she nor the city could control, but it had also been testimony to a basic fact: she had been thirsty. The world might make more of it, But hunger and thirst were human, and human things could not always be weaponized without cost. When the phone rang again that afternoon, the voice on the other end carried a new promise, a discreet offer from the Chi family's lawyer to meet with her privately, a way to clarify things without more public spectacle. There would be questions, there would be tests, there would be old secrets waiting to be asked. Li Ji closed the window against the chill and prepared to step into another kind of light, the one that required a ledger of truth and the courage to keep dancing while the world decided who she might be. The thermos, empty and harmless, kept vigil on the sill, like a small monument to that morning's simple act. Outside, the city rolled onwards. Inside, decisions waited. The narrative had begun with a cup of water and a jog, but it would not end there. Hearts would be tested in courtrooms and rehearsal halls alike, and love, messy, patient, and stubborn, would have to find a way through the noise. The cameras, already hungry for their next cut, hummed in the distance. The swan statue at the studio lobby reflected a pale, moonless light. The story kept moving, and the people at its center would have to choose who they would be when the city stopped wanting a simple answer. She met the lawyer in a room that smelled faintly of lemon and new paper, a place chosen for discretion and the illusion of neutrality. The man wore a suit that held itself in place the way an argument holds a truth, taught, practiced. He sat with his hands folded, as if meditation might make a settlement easier to reach. Across from him, Li Ji folded and unfolded a handkerchief until her fingers remembered the precise pressure of pliés and the steadiness required to land a difficult turn. He began in the language of possibilities. The Chi family, he said, wanted clarity. They wanted to protect what they had built. They were prepared to make a public statement that would remove speculation. They were prepared, if necessary, to pursue legal remedies against those who had spread falsehoods. There were offers, he said, offers to compensate for intrusion, offers to support a foundation that serves dancers, offers framed as kindness. Kindness, she thought, that wanted to be bought. She heard the undertone, a request that she let the narrative settle into an agreed silence. Sign a paper, get a sum, accept the official line. A misunderstanding, an overeager reporter, a miscaptioned photo. They would smooth the edges so society could sleep and the city's appetite be redirected to fresher blood. Li Ji listened through the rhythm of her breath. She weighed not money, but consequence. The foster child whose placement she had helped coordinate and whose drawings were taped inside her studio locker. The friend who had defended her on a live stream and been drained by the ordeal. The company that relied on her in the next season's repertoire. The lawyer's words were careful tools. They would carve away more than scandal. They would carve out a chance to say, simply, that thirst is human. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally. Her voice surprised her with its evenness. "But I'm not interested in erasing what happened." He leaned forward. "You're aware of the risks. The Chi family." "I know who they are," she interrupted. "And I know who I am." She thought of the thermos on the sill, the ordinary object made grotesque by interpretation. She thought of the swan statue that had, for a moment, felt like accusation. If this is about them, then let it be about them. My only concern is that whatever solution you propose doesn't hurt people who had nothing to do with the headline. Silence stretched, not the surprised silence of disbelief, but the measured silence of a negotiator calculating the next move. The lawyer's expression shifted to a version of respect that had been achieved by calculation. "There are people who could be hurt," he admitted, "but there are also people who could be protected." He named names: carefully, as if reading from a list he was allowed to reveal only to those already in the room. He offered concessions, a private meeting with a reporter, agreements on corrections, limited access to images, small, practical safeguards. No admission of guilt. No public apology. Afterward, she walked back to the studio beside the river that had swallowed morning and kept going as if it remembered nothing and everything. The city had a way of presenting choices as binaries: take the money, sign the paper, fight the machine, risk ruin. Her resolve was not dramatic. It was a series of small refusals: to be reduced to a photograph, to let another's wealth dictate what she could say, to allow a child's need to be collateral. Rehearsal that evening acquired a new sharpness. The music was tempered, the sound of the violin bow like wind on glass. Her company watched her through the familiar lattice of stage rivalry and deep devotion. Some of them had their own reasons to be wary now: promises to agents, quiet calls from producers. But when the music rose, the world folded into the space between her shoulders and the line of the bar. Movement translated what words could not. After class, May stayed behind. May had been a foster child who had grown into a young woman with stubborn hands and a notebook full of half-formed choreography. She had come to Lee Z first for lessons, then for dinners, then as someone who could be trusted to bring the kettle when it was time to drink tea. "You could take the offer," May said, practical as ever. "You have reason. You also have people who will stop sleeping if they think you chose otherwise." Lee Z smiled with the tiredness of someone who had been thrust into decision long before she had asked for it. "I have to be able to look at myself," she said, "and at the child who drew swans in my locker. I can't pretend this wasn't real." May touched the thermos on the windowsill as if it were a relic. "It was a moment," she said, "but it's also a thing the world wants to make into a weapon. You decide with weapons." The next day, the city churned in soft waves. A neighborhood group organized a small gathering, words of support, a few handwritten signs, and the paper with the inquisitive headline ran another column about how quickly society projects guilt. A late-night panel tried to untangle the human from the spectacle and found their own comfort in complexity. The jogger watched from a distance, anonymous and, for now, uninterested in being drawn back into the frame. In the weeks that followed, the legal route folded and refolded itself like a difficult score. The Key family strategy oscillated between appeasement and assertion. They offered carefully worded statements about privacy. They suggested charity dinners and discreet donations to causes that would mollify public curiosity. They also hinted, just enough to remind her, that their resources could smooth out other obstacles: a canceled tour here, a delayed promotion there. Power, when not opposed, is persuasive in ways that look like logic. Lee Z kept dancing. She learned new phrases with her feet, shaped sequences that were less about virtuosity and more about insistence, movement as testimony rather than exhibition. In the studio, she worked with the youngest company members, teaching not only steps, but the small rituals that made survival possible: how to breathe through a shoulder injury, how to tell the difference between shame and accountability, how to translate humiliation into fuel. News cycles wavered and then returned. A portrait of her, taken months earlier and repurposed, resurfaced beneath an op-ed about celebrities and responsibility. A commentator misread a social media post and transformed a private grief into a parable. She learned the calculus of attention, how quickly sympathy could become suspicion, how deftly anger could be redirected towards someone who had already lost privacy. And still, there were gestures that mattered. A former student sent a letter recalling rehearsals in the heat of summer, the way they had all shared a single fan and taken turns to sit in its breeze. An elderly patron dropped off a small tin of tea with a note, "I have watched you for 20 years. Keep going." May painted a swan on the studio's bulletin board, not a stylized emblem, but a messy, earnest bird. Wings not sleek, but layered with scratchy strokes, as if each line were a small defiance. One night, after a rehearsal that had left her muscles humming with fatigue, she opened the studio door and found a small cluster of strangers on the sidewalk. They weren't protesters in the sense of accusation. They were people who had danced once, who had known hunger, who had been photographed in a moment that had turned a private need into spectacle. They held nothing more than candles and a few printed pages of poetry. "You could have asked us to leave," said a woman with a patchwork scarf. "But we wanted you to know. We see your feet. We know the weight of each step." Lizzie stood on the threshold and felt for the first time in weeks the city tilt in a way that was not against her. The thermos on the sill, silent and empty, was no longer the beginning of every story. It had become a hinge, an ordinary pivot on which extraordinary patience turned. She thought of the hearing to come, of the documents that would need signatures, of the photographs that might resurface in different hands. The legal men in neat suits could offer settlements and neatness. The city could offer noise. But the people with candles, the child with swan drawings, the student who taped fans in the summer, those were not negotiable. They were the small, true ledger by which she would measure herself. She locked the studio, the sound sharp as a final chord. Outside, the river moved as it always had, carrying away paper and breath and the small debris of public life. Above, the studio's swan statue caught a sliver of moonlight and held it as if it were a promise rather than a verdict. She would meet again with the lawyer.